So thank you for the invitation. I hope you will understand my bad English. So it may seem anachronistic to evoke the medieval period in connection with an African kingdom. We must therefore first ask ourselves why this nomenclature is used and whether it is meaningful. Is it not a retrogressive struggle to assert that there was an Ethiopian Middle Ages at a time when the validity of this restrictive and fixed periodization is being questioned? The division of time is first of all a point of reference. When one speaks of medieval Africa, everyone hears a period covering the 7th to the 15th centuries. This convention allows for dialogue and is addressed above all to those who are interested in history and who could thus sail towards new horizons. This nomenclature should not imply submission to a Eurocentric vision of history. Moreover, the movement of openness that medieval studies have undergone over the last 20 years in connection with connected history and global history has above all made it possible to open up the history of the Western world. The other fields were in a way already looking toward the rest of the world. In large part in the case of Africa, and more particularly Ethiopia, because the corpus of written sources as well as archaeological data makes it necessary to question the connections. Certainly, the Ethiopian Middle Ages is a convention, but it has some validity. From my point of view, it is thus not aberrant to consider that after the fall of the kingdom of Aksum around the 7th century and until the jihad of Hamad ibn Ibrahim at the beginning of the 16th century, Ethiopia was part of a medieval world which refers both to the medieval West and its projection toward the Eastern Africa, notably in the form of the Cruzads, and to the medieval Muslim world, as well as to the Byzantine Empire and its peripheries. One will always find to go beyond these chronological limits and to find continuities where periodization creates breaks, to question this periodization, but globally it remains useful. I believe that there is another dimension that needs to be taken into account when it comes to Ethiopian studies. Ethiopia is most of the time a periphery, regardless of the disciplinary field in which one finds oneself. The periphery of the Muslim world, of the Christian world, of the medieval West, or for example, of the studies on the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. One can even add that Ethiopia is also a periphery of the continent to which it belongs, the African world. It is therefore necessary to look at the history of Ethiopia from the point of view of the medievalist. Today, in the work on Ethiopia, the richest results come from those who open up the approaches based on a global history which considers, for example, the Christianization and Islamization of Ethiopia in equal parts, and who envision these phenomena not as competitors, but as coexisting phenomena, considering the Ethiopian society as constantly redefining themselves and creating a rich culture. In this presentation, I will make reference to some examples that I know better, but of course, it's not at all restrictive. This departitioned approach, the integration of Ethiopian history into medieval studies, among other things, makes it possible to reconsider with fresh eye the way Ethiopian history is affected by its connections to the rest of the world. Several examples may come to mind: circulation of texts, trade, and thus slave trade, but also something we know very well right now. For example, question of the great pandemics, and for the 14th and 15th century, the plague pandemic. The works carried out by Monica Green and Gérard Chouin allowed us to review the question of plague in Africa, and as far as I am concerned, to question the mentions of pandemics in Ethiopia at periods chronologically equivalent to the waves of the Black Death. In reviewing internal written sources of the Ethiopian kingdom, while considering the areas in the world affected by the plague and relations that these areas, Egypt, Yemen, had with Ethiopia, it appeared that there was a need to seriously investigate the possibility of a plague pandemic in Ethiopia in the 14th and especially 15th centuries. We have testimonies at the time of Zara Jacob, in particular, of the development of a cult to Saint Cyriacus, the foundation of a church dedicated to Saint Cyriacus by King Zara Jacob, and the importation into Ethiopia of cults of saints like Saint Roch or Saint Sebastian, well known as anti-plague saints. The study is far from complete, as it should now be possible to measure the impact of this epidemic on Ethiopian society. To give just one more example of recent work that will undoubtedly profoundly change our vision of Ethiopia in the 11th to the 13th centuries, in relationship with the input of medieval studies on Ethiopian history, we can mention the case of the Christian and Muslim communities of foreigners coming from Egypt or the South Arabic Peninsula, settled in the south of the Mekelle region. Known by funerary stelae inscribed in Arabic, the Muslim communities of this region began to provide valuable information about their origins and the importance in numbers they represented. At the same time, with François-Xavier Fauvel, we are working on the site of Mariam Nazareth in the same region, which for a few centuries was the place of residence of the metropolitan sent by the Patriarch of Alexandria to lead the Ethiopian Church. This community included some representatives of the Church of Alexandria in addition to the metropolitan. The proximity of these Arabic speakers in this region, either Christian or Muslims, which can be distinguished from a spatial point of view, necessarily had implications which must be questioned today. By looking only at these connections in a somewhat militant way, what is lost is perhaps identity and history of Ethiopia. For example, in the central plateau of Ethiopia, one can see the very numerous tumuli now known as representative of the Shai culture. These tumuli are home to dead people who are buried with a large number of artifacts, vast majority of which were imported from South Asia with the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. But can we only understand the history of this Shai culture from the perspective of the connection with the Indian Ocean? My answer, as you have guessed, is obviously no. We cannot overvalue the connections so that we only see influences or contacts. Another example, Washa Mikael near Lalibela and the questions of Ethiopian troglodytism or cave dwellers in Ethiopia. At the beginning of the 20th century, Carlo Conti Rossini evoked this peculiarity of Ethiopian society. Part of them were living in caves. Rock churches were all interpreted in the light of a global Christian culture. Rock tomb at the origin of the churches as martyrium, Coptic rock monasteries and their influence on Ethiopia. But shouldn't we also learn from what Washa Mikael tells us? A cavity with hunting scenes transformed into a church. And a lot of things in these cultures are to be compared with something very particular to the Church of Lalibela, a carved decoration as well, which is typical of Lalibela and we cannot see anywhere else. I won't go into more detail here, but I think that the medieval turn in Ethiopian studies is fundamental and opens up new and very important horizons, participating moreover in bringing Ethiopia out of its very particular specificity, out of its peripheral position in relation to all fields, history of Africa, history of the Byzantine Empire, history of the Muslim worlds, of the Christian worlds. But at the same time, it is necessary to maintain an isolationist reading of Ethiopian societies, which makes the identity of this history also independent of all these influences. Everything is in the balance and in what we say in French, the jeu d'échelle, interplay of scales. I don't know if it is the right translation. Thank you for your attention.